Imagine being handed the keys to a global revolution,
Right.
only to realize the architect just died, the blueprints are completely unfinished, and the police are, knocking at the door.
It's a terrifying position to be in.
It really is. You are suddenly solely responsible for a movement stretching from underground labor syndicates in Russia to these explosive railroad strikes in America. Every worker, every organizer, every philosopher is suddenly looking to you for answers.
Yeah, the level of responsibility is just, it's staggering. You aren't just managing an organization at that point. You are supposed to be the brain of an entire historical epoch.
And that is exactly where Friedrich Engels found himself in 1883. For 4 decades, he and Karl Marx had shared one of the most famous intellectual partnerships in human history.
Unprecedented, really.
Totally. But with Marx's death, Engels is left standing alone in their London study. He isn't just grieving his closest friend, he is suddenly the sole guardian of this colossal, unfinished theoretical project.
And that's exactly what we're getting into today.
Exactly. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at a really fascinating stack of sources that document this exact era for Engels. Specifically, a compilation of texts from volume 26 of the Marx and Engels collected works.
Covering the years 1882 to 1889.
Right. So our mission today, and the mission for you listening, is to figure out how Engels actually operated under this crushing weight. How did he hold the movement together? We're going to explore how he synthesized decades of rough notes and collaborative thought into these massive historical, anthropological, and philosophical works.
That's such a crucial window of time, too. It's the 1880s.
Yeah, set the scene for us a bit.
Well, the Industrial Revolution has radically reshaped the physical and social landscape of Europe. And it's just tearing through the United States. The socialist movement is no longer just this small gathering of radical thinkers, arguing in Parisian or German coffee houses.
Right, it's not a niche book club anymore.
Exactly. It's a massive, incredibly complex global phenomenon.
So before we get to the high-level philosophy, let's just talk about the sheer logistics of his life in 1883. We have this letter Engels wrote to August Bebel, who was a major figure in the German socialist movement.
Yeah, that letter is very revealing.
It is. In it, Engels states his goal is to maintain, and I'm quoting here, the many threads from all over the world which spontaneously converged upon Marx's study. So what did that actually look like on a day-to-day basis?
Well, practically, it looked like an overwhelming, never-ending barrage of correspondence and conflict resolution.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, Marx's study wasn't just a library. It was basically the unofficial command center for international socialism.
Oh.
Letters were pouring in continuously from everywhere.
Like what kind of letters?
You had labor organizers in France asking for tactical advice on strikes.
Okay.
You had political exiles in Switzerland trying to resolve internal factional disputes. And theorists in Russia asking how to apply these complex economic models to peasant communes.
And without Marx, all of those letters are now just sitting on Engels' desk. He literally has to be the global switchboard.
And a translator and a mediator, an editor, a theorist, all at once. The intellectual burden was just staggering.
It's like a legendary band losing its primary songwriter,
Yeah.
and leaving the producer to not only finish the ultimate album, but also manage an overwhelming tide of global fan mail.
That's a great analogy. And his immediate response to that burden was to focus heavily on disseminating their foundational works. He had to get them out to this rapidly growing audience.
Right, the sources show him working on translations.
Lots of them. He edited and published the German translation of The Poverty of Philosophy and the French translation of Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte.
Wait, let me pause you there. Why those specific texts, the 1880s, are seeing massive real-time labor struggles all over the place.
Right.
So why is Engels prioritizing a German translation of The Poverty of Philosophy? Marx wrote that way back in 1847. How does a 40-year-old book help a striking coal miner in 1883?
Well, that is the exact question Engels' critics would ask. But the answer really lies in the ideological battleground of the 1880s.
How so?
The labor movement was growing, but it was incredibly fragmented. You had anarchists, utopian socialists, trade unionists, all vying for influence.
It's a very messy political landscape.
Exactly. The Poverty of Philosophy wasn't just an old critique. It was a foundational text that systematically dismantled utopian, unscientific approaches to economics.
I see.
Engels knew that if the newly awakening working class didn't have a rigorous scientific understanding of capitalism,
If they just relied on, moral outrage.
right, if they just relied on romantic ideas about equality, the movement would inevitably collapse or be co-opted.
So he's essentially trying to distribute the intellectual software needed to run the movement correctly.
Precisely. And that required meticulous work. Translation, for Engels, was a deeply political act.
It wasn't just copy-pasting from a dictionary.
Not at all. He wasn't just swapping a German noun for a French noun. He was translating highly complex, deeply nuanced economic concepts across totally different cultural and political landscapes.
Because a sloppy translation could fundamentally alter the political strategy of an entire national party?
Exactly. He had to act as the ultimate quality control officer for their entire theoretical legacy.
That makes a lot of sense. And we also see him writing these massive new prefaces for the re-releases of the Manifesto of the Communist Party.
Yes, specifically the 1883 German edition and the 1888 English edition.
Right. And reading that 1888 English preface, I have to admit I get a slightly different vibe from Engels than just a humble editor keeping the lights on.
What do you mean?
Well, he surveys the global impact of the manifesto, right?
Right.
And he triumphantly notes that it is the most widespread, the most international production of all socialist literature, acknowledged by workers everywhere from Siberia to California.
Oh, yeah?
That sounds less like a grieving caretaker and more like a general marveling at the size of his army. It makes me wonder, did Engels view himself merely as a caretaker, or was he actively expanding the legacy?
There is definitely a profound duality to Engels in this period. Personally, he was incredibly self-effacing. He famously referred to himself as having played second fiddle to Marx's genius.
Right, he always deflected the credit.
Always. But practically, strategically, he was absolutely expanding the legacy by pushing the theory into new languages, by adapting it to the specific conditions of new regions.
Like writing prefaces tailored to the English or American audiences.
Exactly. By doing that, he was transforming a European critique of capitalism into a universal lens for understanding human history.
Okay, speaking of universal lenses, this is where I start to get a little confused by Engels' priorities based on the sources.
How so?
Well, right after taking the helm of this urgent, modern political movement in 1883, he suddenly takes this massive detour.
1884.
Yes. In 1884, he publishes a book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And it's based heavily on the anthropological research of a guy named Lewis H. Morgan, who studied North American Indians.
The Iroquois, specifically.
Right. And I'm just stuck on this. You're managing explosive industrial strikes in London and Germany, and your solution is to sit down and write a book about ancient tribal structures. How is that not just a massive academic distraction?
I know, it seems like a bizarre pivot on the surface.
Oh!
But to Engels, it was actually the most urgent political task of all.
Why?
Think about the fundamental argument defending capitalism in the 19th century. Honestly, even today, the core defense of the status quo is always that it is natural.
The human nature argument.
Yes, the argument goes, human beings are inherently greedy, the nuclear family is the default biological unit, private property has always existed in some form, and the state is just a necessary, eternal referee to keep us all from killing each other.
Right. It's the idea that this is just the way things are, like the laws of physics.
And if that is true, if the state and private property are permanent fixtures of human nature, then the entire socialist project is doomed.
Because arguing for a society without class exploitation would be as absurd as, like, passing a law to abolish gravity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Engels realized that to prove a radically different future was possible, he had to prove that the present system was merely a temporary historical phase.
Ah.
He needed to prove that human beings had lived for the vast majority of our existence on this planet without private property, without a coercive state, and without the patriarchal nuclear family.
So he needs to find the before picture to prove that the current picture isn't prominent?
Exactly. And that brings us to Lewis H. Morgan.
Right. Who was this guy, and what did he actually discover?
Morgan was an American scientist and anthropologist. In 1877, he published this monumental study called Ancient Society. He had spent decades studying and living with the Iroquois in upstate New York.
And he documented their social structures.
Through meticulous observation, yes. He documented their kinship ties, their economic systems, everything.
Wait, so Morgan was just out there studying the Iroquois, and he accidentally built the exact same theoretical machine Marx and Engels were building in Europe?
Pretty much. Engels actually says that Morgan had rediscovered, in his own way, the materialist conception of history.
That is wild. It's like two rival inventors independently inventing the light bulb at the exact same time. It shows how material conditions lead to parallel intellectual discoveries.
That's a perfect way to put it. And Morgan's work provided the empirical, factual baseline that Marx and Engels had been missing.
What were they missing, exactly?
Well, they had hypothesized that early human societies must have been communal, a sort of primitive communism based on their economic deductions. But they didn't have the hard anthropological data to prove it.
And Morgan brought the receipts.
He really did. Morgan demonstrated that among the Iroquois, the fundamental unit of society wasn't the nuclear family. It was the gens, or clan.
Let's break down how a gens actually function, because I think most of us default to picturing ancient history just like modern history, just, with worse technology, like a king, some peasants, and police with spears instead of guns.
Right, projecting the present into the past.
Exactly. So how is the Iroquois gens fundamentally different?
First, the Iroquois gens was matrilineal. Descent and kinship were traced exclusively through the mother's line.
Oh, wow.
Second, and crucially, there was no private ownership of land. The territory was held communally by the gens. Food production was a collective endeavor, and the resources were shared.
So if there's no private property, what happens to the state? Is there a police force, a separate class of politicians?
That's the key. There wasn't one. The gens governed itself democratically through a council where men and women both had a voice.
Okay.
There was no separate coercive apparatus, no police, no prisons, no standing army, separate from the armed people themselves.
So Morgan showed that the state, as this distinct entity standing above society to enforce order, simply did not exist.
It was unnecessary.
Okay, so Morgan discovers this communal, stateless society, but the genius of Engels' book isn't just pointing at the Iroquois and saying, look, a different way to live.
No, he goes much further.
Right. Engels takes Morgan's data and uses it to explain the actual mechanics of how we got from the Iroquois gens to the 19th century Prussian state. He outlines prehistoric stages of culture, breaking them down into savagery and barbarism. And I know those terms sound incredibly dated and pejorative today, but how were they defining them back then in the scientific context?
They were using them as strict classifications of economic and technological development.
Okay.
Savagery roughly corresponded to a hunter-gatherer existence, ending with the invention of the bow and arrow. Barbarism began with pottery, the domestication of animals, and early agriculture.
And then you progress eventually to civilization, which begins with the invention of an alphabet and writing. So we have to neutrally explain Engels' thesis here. What is the exact mechanism that causes the communal, egalitarian gens to collapse and transform into a society with a wealthy class, a poor class, and a state?
In a word,
The sun?
surplus.
Surplus.
Yes. In the early stages, human labor barely produced enough to keep the community alive day to day.
Yeah.
There was literally nothing to hoard.
You eat what you catch.
Exactly. But as tools improved, you get the iron plow, domestication of cattle, large-scale agriculture, human beings suddenly gain the ability to produce a surplus of wealth.
So a family could produce far more grain or cattle than they needed for immediate survival.
And once you have a surplus, you suddenly have something worth protecting. You have the concept of private wealth.
Okay, I follow that.
But it goes deeper. The division of labor in the gens meant that men were typically responsible for procuring food through hunting, and later, animal husbandry and agriculture using these new tools.
Okay.
So as these new tools created massive surpluses of wealth, herds of cattle, vast stores of grain, that new wealth was concentrated in the hands of the men.
Oh, I see where this is going. Because the gens was matrilineal, meaning wealth, and descent passed through the women's side, these newly wealthy men suddenly had a huge problem.
Precisely. They possessed all this new surplus wealth. But under the old clan rules, they couldn't pass it down to their own biological children. It would stay within the mother's clan.
Wow. You've hit on the exact mechanism Engels describes as the world historical defeat of the female sex.
Yes. To secure their ability to pass their newly generated private wealth to their specific heirs, the men overthrew the matrilineal system. They established patriarchal descent and the strict monogamous family.
Monogamous for the women, presumably.
Strictly monogamous for the women, yes, to ensure undisputed paternity of the heirs.
That is fascinating. So the nuclear patriarchal family isn't some eternal biological imperative. According to Engels, it is a historical economic institution invented to manage the inheritance of private property.
And this newly unequal distribution of wealth absolutely shattered the communal gens.
Because now you have rich and poor.
Right. You now had families with massive wealth and families with nothing. Debt emerged. Exploitation emerged. The old Democratic Council of the gens just couldn't resolve the intense, violent conflicts between these newly formed classes.
And let me guess, that is where the state steps in.
Society was tearing itself apart over property. So an institution had to be created to suppress this conflict, to protect the property of the wealthy from the desperately poor, and to enforce the new rules of ownership.
And that institution is the state.
Exactly. The police, the courts, the prison's Engels argues they didn't evolve to protect some abstract concept of universal human rights. They evolved to act as the armed security force for the class that owned the surplus wealth.
The way you explain it, it's like a community garden where everyone shares the harvest, but then one guy invents a super fertilizer, grows 10 times more food, builds a fence around his plot, and then hires armed guards to keep the rest of the community out.
That's a great visual.
The state is just the armed guards. That totally flips the narrative. The state isn't the referee, it's the enforcer. I finally understand why Engels wrote this book.
It was essential. He is proving to the workers in 1884 that the institutions suppressing them were built by historical economics.
Which means they can be unbuilt by historical economics.
Exactly. He fundamentally dismantled the idea of permanence. And having accomplished that monumental anthropological task, he immediately turns his attention from the dirt of ancient history to the high clouds of German philosophy.
Right, which brings us to 1886. Engels publishes Ludwig Feuerbach and the End of Classical German Philosophy. This text is described in the sources as laying down the definitive fundamentals of dialectical and historical materialism.
It was a very necessary intellectual reckoning for the movement.
I have to challenge this, though. We just established why he needed to study anthropology to prove the state wasn't eternal, but why in the world is he wasting time fighting with dead philosophers? I mean, Hegel died in 1831. Feuerbach was relevant in the 1840s. By 1886, the socialist movement has millions of members. Why bother fighting with the ghosts of Hegel and Feuerbach decades later? Why force a German factory worker to read a dense critique of a dead philosopher?
Because a movement without a rigorous philosophical foundation is easily co-opted.
How so?
If you don't clearly understand how to analyze the world, you will fall victim to whoever has the most charismatic but ultimately flawed ideas.
Okay, that makes sense.
The socialist movement was expanding rapidly, and lots of new intellectuals were joining, and they were bringing with them a confusing mishmash of old philosophies. Engels needed to publish the definitive theoretical blueprint.
If the anthropology was the physical archaeological dig, then this philosophical work was him publishing the blueprint of how to actually interpret the findings.
Exactly. It was an instruction manual for how the Marxist mind was supposed to process reality.
Okay, an instruction manual for the mind. Let's look at the faulty operating systems people were running. Let's start with Hegel. What was his worldview, and why did Engels need to clarify his relation to it?
Hegel's great contribution to human thought was the dialectic.
The dialectic.
Right. Before Hegel, most philosophy viewed the world as static, a collection of unchangeable objects and eternal truths. Hegel blew that up.
He said everything is changing.
Yes. He argued that everything in the universe is in a constant state of motion, of coming into being and passing away. And the engine to this constant change is contradiction.
Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Two opposing forces clash, and out of their struggle, a new reality is born.
Exactly. For Hegel, history isn't just a random series of events. It is a dynamic evolutionary process driven by internal struggle. Marx and Engels thought this dialectical method was brilliant.
So they liked Hegel. Where did he go wrong, then?
Hegel was an idealist.
Meaning what, in this context?
He believed that the primary reality of the universe was a mystical cosmic consciousness. He called it the absolute idea, or spirit.
Okay.
For Hegel, the physical world, nature, society, human history was merely a physical reflection of this evolving idea. Historical progress happened because the idea was trying to achieve self-realization.
Oh, wow. So human beings, the economy, the wars, we are all just physical avatars acting out the thoughts of some giant cosmic brain?
It was incredibly mystical.
Yeah.
Hegel had built a spectacular engine of change to dialectic, but he had mounted it upside down. He thought ideas created the physical world.
That sounds almost theological. And then Ludwig Feuerbach comes along in the 1840s and says, no, that's completely backwards.
Correct. Feuerbach was a materialist. He looked at Hegel's massive system and essentially popped the balloon.
Good for him.
Feuerbach argued that the physical material world is the only thing that actually exists. The absolute idea, religion, philosophy, these aren't cosmic forces shaping reality.
They're just thoughts.
Right. They are merely ideas produced by the human brain. And the brain is a physical organ sustained by the material world. Feuerbach dragged philosophy out of the clouds and planted it back on the earth.
So Feuerbach says the physical world shapes our ideas. That sounds exactly like what Marx and Engels believe. So why did Engels need to write a whole book critiquing him too?
Because while Feuerbach correctly identified that the material world is the foundation of reality, his understanding of the material world was completely flat and static.
He didn't use the dialectic.
Exactly. He abandoned Hegel's dialectic. Feuerbach viewed nature and humanity as abstract, unchanging categories.
Mhm.
He didn't see human beings as active historical agents who are constantly altering their material environment through labor and industry.
And by altering their environment, altering their own nature.
Yes.
Okay, I think I see the mechanism here. Hegel had the engine of change the dialectic, but it was running on the wrong fuel, mystical ideas.
Love that analogy.
And Feuerbach had the correct fuel, the physical, material world, but he threw away the engine. His materialism couldn't explain historical change, it just observed a static physical reality.
That is a phenomenal synthesis. And what Engels does in this 1886 book is explicitly detail how he and Marx extracted Hegel's dialectical engine, discarded the mystical idealism, and fueled it with a robust, active understanding of the material world.
And the result is dialectical materialism.
Yes, which means looking at history as a process of constant contradictory struggle, but knowing that the struggle is driven by physical, economic realities, not ideas.
So the way we produce our food, the tools we use, the way we organize our labor, that is the material base.
And that base is constantly evolving, constantly generating new classes that clash with each other.
And the ideas in our heads, our laws, religions, philosophy, they're just the superstructure built on top of that shifting economic foundation.
Exactly. By writing this book, Engels gave the working class the ultimate analytical tool. He taught them not just what to think about history, but how to think about reality itself.
And having built that analytical tool, he immediately takes it for a test drive in the real world.
He does.
We see Engels turn from the heights of abstract philosophy straight into the muddy, granular details of European history. He wants to prove that historical materialism isn't just a parlor trick for intellectuals, right? It can actually decode the history of Europe.
And he does this through two fascinating works from this period. An essay called The Mark, written in 1882, and an unfinished manuscript titled The Role of Force in History, written between 1887 and 1888.
Let's start with the mark. The term mark refers to the ancient communal land-holding system of the Germanic tribes, similar to the Iroquois gens we talked about earlier.
Right. Engels looks at how early Germanic peoples held land in common, governed themselves democratically in village councils, and how this system was slowly, violently dismantled over centuries.
But what stands out to me in the sources is the level of empirical evidence Engels marshals here. He isn't just theorizing.
No, he dives into hyper-specific agricultural data.
Right. The texts show him extensively analyzing the work of August Meitzen, a German statistician. Engels is looking at Meitzen's data tables concerning redemption operations in Prussia from 1816 up to 1865.
It's incredibly detailed work.
But what exactly is a redemption operation? To modern ears, it sounds like a religious revival.
It was an economic and legal restructuring of massive proportions. In the early 19th century, following the Napoleonic Wars, Prussia initiated a series of agrarian reforms. The most famous was the Edict of October, 1807.
And what did that do?
It legally abolished serfdom.
So the peasant serfs, who were legally bound to the land and forced to work for the feudal lords, the Junkers, were finally declared free citizens.
Yes.
I mean, that sounds like a massive victory for human rights.
Well, it was definitely branded as a victory for freedom, but historical materialism teaches us to look past the legal rhetoric and examine the material economic reality.
Follow the money.
Exactly. Engels looked at Meitzen's data and saw the exact mechanism of how this freedom actually played out on the ground.
Walk me through that mechanism. If I am a Prussian serf named Hans in 1815 and the king declares me a free man, what actually happens to my life?
Well, Hans, you are no longer legally tied to the Junkers' estate. You can travel, you can marry whoever you want.
That's great so far.
But there's a catch. To redeem your freedom and gain clear, private title to the small plot of land you've been farming your whole life, the new laws require you to compensate the junker for his loss of your forced labor.
Compensate him how? I'm a serf. I don't have a vault full of gold.
Since you have no money, the law requires you to cede a massive portion of your land, sometimes up to half or even 2/3 of your plot, directly to the junker as payment for your freedom.
Wait a minute. So I am legally free, but now the plot of land I own is so small I can't possibly grow enough food to feed my family.
Precisely.
So what must you do to survive?
You have to walk right back up to the Junkers estate, which is now massive because he just absorbed half the land of every serf in the village, and beg for a job as a wage laborer.
That is an incredibly brutal sleight of hand.
It was the engine of agrarian capitalism. Engels used Meisen's tables to prove that these redemption operations weren't about human rights. They were a systemic mechanism to illegally dispossess the peasantry of their land.
So the feudal lords transformed themselves into wealthy, capitalist, agricultural monopolists.
Yes, and the freed serfs were transformed into a desperate, landless rural proletariat who had no choice but to sell their labor for pennies.
It perfectly illustrates his philosophical point. The legal idea of freedom was just a superstructure covering up a massive transfer of material wealth. The economic base dictated the reality.
Exactly.
And this focus on underlying economics over political rhetoric brings us perfectly to his other major historical work of this period, the role of force in history.
This is one of his most incisive pieces of historical analysis. He takes on the dominant narrative of the 19th century, that history is driven by great men wielding military force.
Right, the great man theory of history. You think of Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian prime minister. His famous speech declared that the great questions of the day would not be decided by speeches, but by iron and blood.
Force is the engine, according to that theory.
Yeah. Conquest, military genius, raw power, that is what shapes borders and builds nations.
But Engels steps in and says, force is undoubtedly real, and it is devastating. But it is not the primary cause of history.
Then what is?
Force is merely the means. The aim, the reason the force is deployed in the first place is always economic.
That feels counterintuitive. If a king raises an army and slaughters his neighbors, isn't he just driven by a lust for power and glory?
Power to do what, though? Glory to achieve what? Engels argues that a state doesn't maintain a massive, expensive military apparatus just for the aesthetic thrill of violence.
So do. Wars are expensive.
Very. They use force to acquire highly specific economic assets. Arable land, taxable populations, trade routes, access to raw materials, or captive markets. The military force is a tool wielded by the economic base.
How does he apply this to Bismarck? Because Bismarck literally unified the German Empire through a series of brilliant, aggressive wars against Denmark, Austria, and France in the 1860s and 70s. That looks like pure, unadulterated political force.
Engels looks under the hood of Bismarck's military machine. Why did Germany need to be unified in the first place? Before Bismarck, Germany was a chaotic patchwork of dozens of independent states and principalities.
And each one had its own rules.
Right. Each had its own tariffs, its own currency, its own trade laws, weights, and measures.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare if you were trying to run a business.
It was paralyzing. The rising German capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, were trying to build factories, lay railroads, and compete with the massive unified industrial powers of England and France.
But they were being choked to death by this fragmented system.
Exactly. You couldn't ship coal from one German city to another without paying tariffs at 5 different borders and exchanging currency 3 times.
I see the mechanism. The German industrialists desperately needed a massive, unified national market. They needed one set of laws, one currency, one railway network. The economic base was demanding unification.
Exactly. The material conditions of industrial capitalism made a unified Germany an absolute economic necessity.
And Bismarck just provided the political and military force to smash the old borders and make it happen.
Right. Engels argues that if Bismarck hadn't done it, someone else eventually would have, or the German economy would have collapsed. Bismarck wasn't a wizard conjuring history out of thin air. He was the executor of an economic imperative.
The ledger books and the factory owners were pulling the strings of the cavalry charges.
Precisely.
It is such a clarifying way to view geopolitics, even today. Whenever we see a massive deployment of state force or a sudden war, historical materialism trains us to stop looking at the political rhetoric and start looking for the economic necessity driving it.
It's a very powerful analytical tool.
And it's fascinating because, having used this method to dissect ancient history and recent geopolitics, Engels then turns the exact same critical lens onto the history of his own movement.
Yes, he mines the history of the early communist movement to extract vital tactical lessons for the organizers of the 1880s.
We see this in texts like On the History of the Communist League, an article called Marx and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, and a piece on the insurrection of May 1849. He is looking back at the explosive, chaotic period of the 1848 democratic revolutions across Europe.
And what stands out most in the sources is his intense focus on a specific internal factional dispute from 1850, the split with the Willett-Schapper group.
Right. This is where Engels acts not just as a historian, but as a protective elder statesman trying to prevent the next generation from repeating a fatal mistake.
Very much so.
So what exactly happened in 1850? To set the scene, the 1848 revolutions had swept across Europe. Mass uprisings demanding democracy, workers' rights, the overthrow of monarchies.
But by 1850, those revolutions had largely been crushed by the old conservative powers.
The momentum was broken.
Right. And Marx and Engels analyzed the global economic data, things like the gold discoveries in California, the expansion of global trade, and realized that a massive era of capitalist prosperity was beginning.
They concluded scientifically that the immediate revolutionary window had closed.
Yes. The material conditions no longer supported an armed uprising. The economy was stabilizing.
So Marx and Engels told their secret organization, the Communist League, that they needed to face reality. They needed to hunker down, focus on educating the workers, build underground networks, and prepare for a long, slow period of organizing.
The revolution was not going to happen next week.
But the Willett-Schapper faction within the League fiercely disagreed.
They vehemently rejected this sober economic analysis. August Willich and Karl Schapper were romantic revolutionaries. They believed that revolutions weren't driven by boring economic cycles. They were driven by sheer willpower.
Daring action, passionate rhetoric.
Right. They argued that if they just organized a bold enough strike, if they just incited enough chaos, they could force a revolution into existence through sheer revolutionary zeal.
It's the triumph of the will over material reality.
And Engels viewed this as incredibly dangerous. He called it revolutionary alchemy. The Willett-Schapper group actually split from Marx and Engels in late 1850.
And what did they do?
They went off to organize independent, highly reckless, and highly visible conspiracies to try and trigger an immediate uprising in Germany.
Which I imagine went terribly wrong.
It was a complete disaster. Because they were ignoring the material reality that the masses were not ready to rise up, their conspiracies were isolated and easily infiltrated.
Because the police found out.
Oh, yeah. Their loud, reckless posturing gave the Prussian secret police exactly the pretext they were looking for. The police fabricated evidence, linked the Willett-Schapper plots to the entire socialist movement, and launched the infamous Cologne Communist Trial of 1852.
Innocent organizers were rounded up and sent to prison.
Yes. The entire German underground network was essentially decimated for years, all because a faction couldn't adapt their tactics to the sober reality of the economic situation.
Wow. Put yourself in Engels' shoes for a moment as he writes this in 1885. He is writing the history of a secret, illegal society that he himself helped found.
Talk about pressure.
Right. He knows that every word he writes is going to be scrutinized by passionate young socialists looking for inspiration, but it will also be read by the German state police, who are actively outlawing socialist organism under Bismarck's anti-socialist laws. That is an impossible tightrope to walk.
He has to keep the revolutionary fire alive, honoring the sacrifices of 1848, while aggressively condemning the romantic adventurism that gets people thrown in jail for no strategic gain.
It feels incredibly relevant today. You see this tension in modern political movements all the time. The conflict between the slow, unglamorous, behind-the-scenes work of building institutional power versus the immediate, visceral thrill of loud, confrontational street protests.
Protests that might feel revolutionary but often just alienate the public.
And invite a massive police crackdown. Engels is screaming across the centuries, respect the material conditions, don't let your passion override your strategy.
He is demanding a scientific approach to political organizing. And he doesn't just demand it in hindsight. He applies this rigorous materialist analysis to the explosive, real-time events unfolding around him in the late 1880s.
Which brings us to the final major theme in this volume, the modern working class in motion. Engels is not just a historian sitting in a dusty archive. He is actively mapping his highly complex theory onto real-time labor movements across the globe.
He is constantly observing the shifting dynamics of the working class. For instance, the sources highlight his writings on the Ruhr miners' strike of 1889.
The Ruhr Valley in Germany was the industrial heartland, massive coal mines, steel mills.
Yes, and Engels saw this strike as a watershed moment. For a long time, the organized socialist movement in Germany was largely made up of skilled artisans, tailors, shoemakers, cigar makers, and intellectuals.
The craft.
Right. The massive, brutalized, heavy industrial proletariat in the coal mines had remained unorganized and isolated.
But in 1889, over 100,000 miners walk out.
And Engels emphasizes the immense strategic importance of this new detachment entering the struggle. These were the workers who actually controlled the energy supply of the German Empire.
Right, if there's no coal, nothing works.
When they woke up and flexed their muscles, the entire capitalist machine ground to a halt. He saw the center of gravity in the labor movement shifting decisively toward heavy industry.
But his vision isn't limited to Europe. This is where the sources get incredibly fascinating regarding the American front.
America was vital to him.
Right. The United States in the 1880s is in the throes of the Gilded Age. Massive monopolies, robber barons, brutal railroad strikes, and explosive urban poverty. And Engels sees America as this massive, chaotic, untapped frontier for the labor movement.
He engages deeply with the American situation. He begins corresponding with an American socialist named Florence Kelly Wisniewski.
And what do they do together?
She takes a book Engels had written 40 years earlier, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845, and she translates and prepares it for an 1887 New York edition.
That is brilliant. Think about the strategic implication. Engels wrote that book as a young man, documenting the absolute horrors of the English Industrial Revolution in Manchester. The slums, the disease, the child labor.
The sheer exploitation of the factory system.
Now, over 4 decades later, he is packaging those exact same lessons for an American audience.
Because the underlying mechanics of capitalism are identical. The American bourgeoisie liked to believe that the U.S. was an exceptional land of classless opportunity, immune to the miseries of old Europe.
Right, the American dream.
But Engels writes a special appendix for this American edition titled The Labor Movement in America. He argues that America is simply running the exact same capitalist software as England, just on a much grander, faster scale.
The same causes will inevitably produce the same effects.
Exactly. The American worker is going to face the exact same exploitation and must eventually arrive at the exact same conclusion: the necessity of an independent political party of the working class.
And as he is analyzing America, he encounters the massively popular American economic theorist Henry George. I have to admit, Henry George is a fascinating figure who kind of gets lost in modern history. Who was he, and why was Engels analyzing him?
Henry George was an American journalist and economist. He wrote a wildly influential book in 1879 called Progress and Poverty.
And what was his main focus?
He was trying to solve the great paradox of the Gilded Age. Why does increasing industrial progress and wealth inevitably produce deepening, grinding poverty for the masses?
A question that is, unfortunately, still highly relevant. What was George's solution?
George argued that the root of all economic injustice was the private monopoly of land.
Land, specifically.
Yes. He believed that people should fully own the value they produce with their own labor, but that the economic value derived from land, which was created by nature and society, not by any individual's labor, should belong equally to all members of society.
So his solution was the famous single tax.
Yes. He proposed abolishing all other taxes and replacing them with a single tax on the value of land.
Okay.
He argued this would break the power of the land speculators, free up capital, and distribute the wealth of the earth equitably, solving poverty without needing to overthrow the entire capitalist system.
It sounds like a very elegant, very American reform. You don't have to seize the factories, you just tax the ground they sit on. So how did Engels, the architect of historical materialism, respond to this? Did he support it as a step in the right direction?
Engels appreciated that Henry George was stirring up the American working class and forcing them to think about economic inequality. But theoretically, Engels critiqued his system severely.
Why?
He saw the single tax as a fundamentally flawed diagnosis of the capitalist disease.
Walk me through the mechanism of Engels' critique. Why doesn't the single tax work for a Marxist? Let's use a hypothetical. Imagine a factory worker in an 1880s New York textile mill. If Henry George's single tax is passed, and the wealthy landlord who owns the land under the factory has his land value heavily taxed and redistributed, does the factory worker's life improve?
Not at the fundamental level of production. Engels argued that focusing exclusively on the monopoly of land ignores the far more powerful and destructive monopoly of capital.
Meaning the steam engines, the heavy machinery, the raw materials, the massive factories themselves.
Because the worker doesn't just need a plot of land to survive in an industrialized economy. They need access to the machines.
Exactly. Even if you neutralize the landlord with a single tax, the factory owner, the capitalist, still exclusively owns the means of production.
Right.
The worker, having no tools or machines of their own, is still forced to sell their labor to the capitalist.
And the capitalist will still extract surplus value from that labor, paying the worker a subsistence wage while keeping the profits generated by the worker's effort.
So removing the landlord doesn't remove the exploitation, it just leaves the industrial capitalist as the sole master of the worker.
Precisely. Engels wrote that Henry George's theory was inherently a bourgeois reform. It was designed to save capitalism from its worst excesses, land speculation, without challenging the core mechanism of wage labor and the private ownership of industry.
So Engels saw it as a temporary stepping stone.
Yes, he analyzed George's massive popularity as a symptom of the American workers waking up to their exploitation, but he knew the movement would eventually have to discard George's theories to achieve true emancipation.
The breadth of what Engels is processing simultaneously is just astounding. We've talked about German coal strikes and American economic theory, but the sources also show him engaging in incredibly eclectic intellectual deep dives during this exact same window.
Absolutely.
There is a text mentioned in our sources titled The Book of Revelation, written in 1883. You hear that and think, wait, did the co-author of the Communist Manifesto suddenly become an apocalyptic theologian?
Not quite. But he did apply the lens of historical materialism to biblical texts. He didn't read the Book of Revelation as a supernatural prophecy of the end of the world.
How did he read it?
He analyzed early Christianity historically. He viewed it as a mass underground movement of the most severely oppressed classes in the Roman Empire: slaves, the desperately poor, conquered peoples.
So how does he interpret the wild apocalyptic imagery of Revelation, the multi-headed beasts, the horror of Babylon?
He reads it as a coded revolutionary text. Early Christians were facing brutal systemic persecution by the Roman state. They couldn't openly circulate pamphlets calling for the violent overthrow of the emperor. They would be immediately executed.
That makes sense.
So according to Engels, they wrote in heavily coded allegory. The terrifying beasts and the apocalyptic judgments were the underground, revolutionary hopes of a crushed people dreaming of the total destruction of the Roman state machine.
That is just brilliant. He takes the apocalypse and decodes it as an ancient political manifesto. And the sources also mention pieces like Lawyer's Socialism from 1886, where he attacks reformist legal theories, plus numerous interviews and statements for the New Yorker Volkszeitung, guiding the German-American immigrant working class.
It is the ultimate testament to the power of the dialectical materialist method he and Marx developed.
Oh, so.
If you truly understand the core mechanics that the economic base, the way humans produce and reproduce their survival, ultimately shapes the social, political, and ideological superstructure, then you can point that analytical lens at literally anything.
Right. You can point it at the Iroquois kinship system, at the agricultural reforms of Prussia, at the theology of the Roman Empire, or at the railroad strikes of New York.
And you can decode the underlying reality of all of them.
So we have covered an incredible amount of ground today. Let's pull back and synthesize what we've learned from this immense stack of sources covering 1882 to 1889. We started with an image of Engels standing alone in a study, holding the fractured threads of a global movement after the death of Marx.
And we have seen definitively that he was not merely a caretaker dusting off old books. He was the vital architect of the movement's expansion.
He took the core economic critiques that he and Marx had developed and expanded them into a comprehensive universal worldview. He dug deep into the anthropological dirt with Lewis H. Morgan to dismantle the myth of human nature, proving that the coercive state and the patriarchal family were temporary historical phases created by private property.
He wrote the definitive philosophical instruction manual, settling accounts with Hegel and Feuerbach to show the expanding global movement exactly how to think dialectically and materialistically.
He took that new intellectual engine for a test drive through European history, exposing how the legal freedom of Prussian serfs was actually a mechanism for capitalist dispossession, and proving that Bismarck's military force was just a tool wielded by economic necessity.
He mined the painful history of the 1848 revolutions and the Communist League to issue a stark warning to modern organizers: respect the material conditions and avoid the trap of reckless romantic adventurism that only invites state repression.
And he proved the immediate, urgent relevance of this entire theoretical apparatus by mapping it onto the explosive labor movements of his day, from the waking giants of the Ruhr coal mines to the massive, turbulent industrial frontiers of Gilded Age America. Friedrich Engels built the philosophical, anthropological, and historical scaffolding that would define global socialist theory for the next century.
His output during this period fundamentally altered how millions of human beings understood their place in the grand sweep of history. It gave them the theoretical tools to realize that they were not just victims of an eternal, unchanging system, but active participants in a historical process that could be changed.
And that profound realization leaves us with something very specific to reflect on. Engels utilized the study of ancient tribal societies to argue that the concepts we take for granted as permanent and natural, the nuclear family, the necessity of a police force, the private ownership of land, are actually just temporary historical phases.
They emerged under specific economic conditions.
Right. And as those conditions change, those institutions will inevitably pass away, much like the prehistoric stages of savagery or barbarism.
It forces us to question the permanence of our own reality.
Exactly. We like to think that the world around us is fixed. We assume the system we live in is the final, evolved state of humanity. But Engels' massive analytical project argues that the structures governing us right now are just another passing stage in human evolution. So I want to turn to you, the listener, and ask, if you look around at the seemingly immutable, unquestionable social structures governing your life today, the way you work, the way you are governed, the way property is held, which of them are destined to be viewed by future historians not as eternal laws of nature, but merely as the bizarre, temporary artifacts of the 21st century?
A question that demands rigorous historical thought.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you, and we'll see you next time.